It's that time of year again. Eggnog, cheery jingles, lingerie that has fake fur bits, which just seems like it would absorb sweat when, lingerie activities commence. Certain groups of people like to celebrate this as the time the purported god of the universe had to get his ass wiped for 18 months minimum because he kept pooping himself. Their argument, not mine. With all of these festivities, it's due time I look at a bunch of spooky stuff. That makes very little sense. I think this hat is too small. It's restricting my brain space or something. Besides, this certainly can't be that original of an idea. Certainly someone has already done that. Happy Horrordays? That's just too obvious of a theme. Content warning. This festive holiday video contains unsettling imagery and themes of mental health issues, self-mutilation, and suicide. Regardless of originality or season appropriateness, I'm starting with Layers of Fear. Fayers of Lear, released back in 2016, made by Bloober Team, which is a very silly name for a studio that makes horror games. Just saying. I played it way back then, but hadn't played it since. I knew I'd need some footage of my favorite moment of the game for when I eventually make one of my countdown videos. Specifically, about memorable jump scares. At the rate I make those, I'm sure that one will be out by 2027, perhaps. Subscribe to see that someday. The interesting thing about revisiting this, at least in my shoes, is that while I remembered certain specifics and several broad strokes, I had lost a lot of the finer details in the in-between. See, I was dealing with very bad depression at the time, and it turns out depression is linked, quite reliably, to memory impairment. There was a window in my life where just about any game that wasn't Arkham Knight became an ill-defined blur. That means I more or less got to experience Assassin's Creed Unity's highs and lows relatively fresh all over again when I covered it here. Yippee. Turns out, the real horror is mental health issues. How thematically appropriate. If you're not familiar with the title, Layers of Fear was one of several games looking to fill the void left when the highly acclaimed psychological horror experience, PT, was delisted. See, there, you walked around in a house which kept looping and changing, being geometrically impossible, and there were themes of failing or even likely harming your family. It was ambiguous, and sometimes there was a spooky ghost lady. Layers of Fear is one of the most, almost shamelessly similar games to that description. That Venn diagram is much narrower than a lot of other titles. But unlike a lot of those other games, Fear of Layers is actually pretty good at what it's going for. Looking at you, The Park. That game is bad. Maybe I'll talk about it sometime. Layers' most central significant difference is the framing narrative. You play as an artist whose mental health is not in good shape as he's trying to paint his magnum opus. One quick thing you may have noticed from my snippets of footage. There's a little goober up in the top corner. Little creepy boy. One version of the artist's in-progress painting, which the game sometimes uses as promo art too. This is weird but not unheard of. Apparently, some games can and will slap a promotional watermark up in the top left corner when you use built-in PS4 game recording. Technically, I've only ever run into this one other time in my video editing career, with Soma, which I briefly alluded to while discussing Assassin's Creed Unity, which I just cannot escape apparently. But the watermark there was technically useful, since I didn't name-drop Soma in the video, and would have put it on screen anyway. It's obnoxious here though, because I think, just maybe, my audience will be able to decipher where this footage comes from through context. Even if they couldn't, this little fucker doesn't exactly help, and it's kinda unpleasant to look at, but it also loses its horror appeal if you keep looking at it, so I'm gonna swap it out with random images I've had DALL-E generate while goofing off for months now. Because the real horror is corporations trying to replace human artists with AI. While my video's title is certainly foreshadowing some criticisms, I do want to emphasize that if you're just looking for an immersive, psychological horror, haunted house kind of game, Payers of Tyr will deliver what you are looking for very well. I'm a nitpicky bitch, but there is nothing here that will ruin the core experience for most players. If you wish to go and experience things unspoiled, now is a good place to pause until you do so. But please come back when you're done. I'll miss you, waiting right here for you. I will not be wearing Christmas lingerie though. I've been over it. I do not want sweaty titties. So this is one of those games where the story unlocks piecemeal as you go. The general picture, as you eventually discover it, is that the protagonist artist, set in a very ambiguous time period, has suffered some personal tragedies. At some point, he has lost a leg, which is replaced by a prosthetic. Nice attention to detail. Movement is animated subtly differently when he takes a step on each side. He also previously had a wife and a child. The wife at some point was scarred in a fire, and then later died. His daughter was taken away by social services, so he is truly alone now. Here's the thing. The artist is a conceited asshole, which is directly related to both points. He directly, obsessively fixates on his wife's scar as some sort of hideous blemish, to the point that his wife grew to loathe him. Asterisk, if we can even trust his perspective on the details we do see. We'll come right back around to that. He eventually finds his wife dead in the bathtub with a bloody knife, implying that she killed herself, but the game presents enough evidence through its ambiguity that he may have possibly killed her there, either out of self-defense or maliciously, and simply doesn't consciously know it due to his mental state. Sometimes he sees giant eyeballs looking in the door. All bets are off with this dude's perspective. In his mourning, his alcoholism, anger issues, and neglect get his daughter taken away. So, his attempt at painting one more great work is his way of trying to cope with grief and self-loathing and self-doubt. Except, small wrinkle, he's possibly using human body parts for his painting. Like, he certainly thinks he is, but again, unreliable narrator. And other details imply he isn't. It's even unclear where he's sourcing his, unorthodox supplies, if he is in fact using them. Are the blood and bone and finger from him? Hair for his brush is collected in a segment all about his daughter, so that creates scary implications. At the end, he even gets an eyeball from somewhere, and he clearly intends it to represent someone else looking at his work. So that seems to imply he's getting it from, say, a body? His wife's, perhaps? Dunno. The point of this ambiguity is that this game never gives confirmation of how much of what we're seeing is supernatural, how much is just in his head, or what combination of the two is at play. It's for the purposes of being spooky, but personally, I do think it creeps into a bit of a mess. Point number one. The ambiguity accidentally pulls back the overarching horror just a little bit by not grounding something. I'll explain. This game, in a vacuum, is perfectly willing to imply that it's all just in his head. It's now part of a series with other people suffering spooky hallway set pieces and overarching themes that would better imply the possibility of malevolent supernatural forces, but that doesn't matter right now. I don't think they were setting up anything else, and originally only thought of this as its own standalone thing. The problem is that if it's all just in his head, it's no longer scary once you stop playing. Is he a threat to the people around him? Nah. He's not actually harvesting body parts or nothing. He just sees visions of darkness and evil sometimes. Is there something unknown out to get him? Nope. You see how that defangs the horror a little? Even if he was a threat to others, but the rest is just all in his head, it still doesn't let the dread linger outside of playing. His wife and dog are both already gone, possibly at his hand. Yes, the artist may have killed his dog. He deserves his suffering. And that's spookier than our last alternative. But now he's alone. Social services saw a potentially hazardous environment and responsibly removed the kid from that environment. The system actually working as intended for once. Spooky. Even if you wanted to go be a danger to someone else, it's going to take him a while. This game has established he doesn't have an efficient prosthetic leg. He ain't kidnapping his daughter back with that without a massive head start. What I'm trying to get at is that fear of the unknown is the part that's scary about ambiguity. So you have to make at least one supernatural detail concretely unambiguous to hold on to this type of horror effectively. Otherwise, skeptical assholes have the option of chalking it up to naturalistic explanations. There are a couple of great horror classics that understand this perfectly. One is PT, the project this one is emulating. See, at the end of PT, it revealed the whole thing was a playable teaser for a now cancelled Silent Hill project. Silent Hills! Setting it firmly in one of the best ambiguous horror settings you can find. In that world, there is a real, dangerous, physical place of real, dangerous, physical supernatural horrors, but it also manifests your psychological horrors, so you constantly have to doubt reality at least a little. You can't be sure where the line is, so the horror lingers. The other one is The Shining, the movie. It's better than the book, sorry Steven. The Shining makes it very hard to pin down how much is Jack Torrance's own psychosis, until he's locked in a pantry, and a ghost unlocks it since he couldn't have done that on his own. After that, his wife also sees ghosts, and I guess his son was seeing ghosts before that too, but they also could have been losing their minds together, but separately. But they couldn't have been, not every time, when we see a ghost physically interact with the world exactly once. Now, it's unambiguously ambiguous. Bit of a mess point number 2. The puzzles get pretty sloppy. Some of it is also due to the hands-off nature of the presentation, but sometimes the horror comes to a screeching halt because the problem solving is so unintuitive. Like, earlier in the game, there's a phonograph and playing it a certain way burns and melts the room. You have to do that to get an item, and then undo that to get back out. But it's way too convoluted. There's the speed settings to one side and the crank handle, and then a separate switch on the back, but the handle doesn't like to behave because the motion you make with the controller stick is wonky, and so doing this the right way requires a whole bunch of trial and error, all the while the game is just having to wait on standby to be spooky, because it's only spooky when you trigger the right things to be spooky. It's far worse at one right at the end of the game. Up until that point, there's a strict structure of find body part for painting, return to studio room, start next chapter, which the game repeats for the first 5 of 6 chapters. The last chapter, though, you go pick up the eyeball, and then it smashes in an entire extra puzzle segment, which derails the pacing. You're in a room with a spooky game of checkers, and you keep having to find tiny-ass checkers as it keeps adding reused assets from earlier in the game around you. It's obnoxious, finding tiny-ass checkers one at a time. The environments aren't that scary, since we've already gone through them, and I don't care how many scare chords or twitchy animations you add, you cannot make the game of checkers scary. I was genuinely surprised once when Assassin's Creed made a game of checkers effectively dramatic, but scary is out of the question. Bit of a mess point number 3, and I guess this one's more minor and just bothers me as a writer, but I feel like it's juggling just a bit too much in recurring motifs without dedicating the same focus for all of them to feel justified. His art is a big one, and the wife and daughter both have several sub-themes, each within their motifs, and then his leg is another one, and then fire is another one, and then his dog is one, and body parts are one, and those sometimes link together in big and small ways. Then there's the motif of rats. He's obsessed with rats that may not be there, and they don't cleanly fit into the narrative of this game, Other than that, he finds them icky. Oven-roasted fingers are fine, rats are icky. Now, I have the foreknowledge that rats come up as a recurring theme in later games, too, so it technically is justified in having it there, assuming they did, despite my suspicions, have plans for a sequel all along. I wager they were actually working on a sequel and someone just liked the whole rat thing, and so picked up that loose thread, but I don't really have a way of knowing. Bit of a mess point number 4. The endings. Both getting to them and also what happens in one of them in particular. So I guess that's 2 points. Keep track. How you earn each ending is a little bit unclear outside of the broad strokes. The first time I played it, I bumbled into the good ending blindly, and the second time, this time, with some memory of what was happening, but enough of a blurriness I was likely playing it roughly the same way, I got the more middle ground, not so good ending that isn't the worst ending. Now, the scale that determines your ending is how many of the personal memento collectibles you find, and how many times you effing bite it. The problem is, I likely found nearly the same collectibles as when I played it in 2016, and as far as I can tell, had roughly the same number of deaths, which was not a high count either time. The deaths aren't always foreshadowed well. They're either the most blatant choices in the world. Don't approach a twitchy ghost. Don't set the elevator to bloodstained when it gives you a non-bloodstained direction to go in, or they're obtuse AF. Ignore the lamp sitting on a wheelchair. I know that sounds fascinating, but lamps on a wheelchair are apparently the real threats. The bit I specifically wanted footage of for my eventual countdown video is a very memorable moment, where a door tells you not to look back, and you die if you do that. I apparently tend to really micromanage my gaming movements on the left stick from years of gaming, and this time around I had the most subtle movement back on the left stick as I was going. I'm not sure if I was avoiding a fluttering curtain to get better footage, or if I just responded ever so slightly to the scare chord that plays when the message appears, but the game declared a 5% move backwards on the left stick is the same as turning 180 degrees on the right stick, and I died anyway. So I had to replay the chapter to that point twice after finishing the game to get the footage I needed. Not that this is necessarily a bad thing to get the somewhat bad ending, as it is actually my favorite one in the game. So the worst ending, the one I have never actually gotten and had to watch online. The painter is trying to paint his whole family, but realizes it will never bring them back to him, so he self-immolates. The less bad ending, he paints his wife, but then it warps into having this hideous flaw, and so he throws into a room with dozens of duplicates, all laughing at him, showing that he's caught in this hellish Sisyphean loop, and it's an effective ending. It's thematically connected in a resounding way, and it lets you explore the house sans hallucinations again for a bit. So you can actually go back into the room and see all of the paintings aren't even like that for real. It's just his wife's relatively minor scar that he hyperfixates on. It's the good ending that doesn't really land for me. In that one, he paints a self-portrait and escapes the madness, finding public success again. It plays this as him embracing his selfishness and metaphorically forgetting his family. So in this one, the character arc is that he's a selfish asshole, and then he gets out of the consequences of this by being a selfish asshole some more. For some reason, that don't really resonate as much with me. Bit of a mess point number 6. The entire Inheritance DLC. See, when I was playing through this, at first I was like, gee, it will be neat to finally check out the additional content since I never played it back then. Then I was going through my trophy data and I had unlocked DLC trophies back in 2016. My brain had legitimately just rejected any recollection of the experience, and having replayed it, I can see why. It's just not scary. So in this, the daughter goes to the long empty house years later to get closure, and as she's looking at stuff, she gets flashbacks to being a kid and having horrific hallucinations, which should feel especially vulnerable. But they don't. In those, you're tiny, sure, but then it all feels like rejected ideas from the main game. There's also a flashlight function added in, but instead of any meaningful gameplay functions, it literally only serves as a flashlight for the parts where you're not tripping balls. There are no meaningful gameplay additions beyond just being able to see. Her endings feel equally underwhelming. She either realizes her father was flawed and forgives him, intentionally burning down the house, realizes the same and doesn't forgive him, accidentally trapping herself inside as the house burns down, or works extra hard for the secret ending and just becomes an implicitly insane painter too. In the first ending, by the way, she just proceeds to be the same kind of asshole to her own kids' art, meaning no one ever learns anything in the good endings. Now, there is a bit where you help this toy cat get its wheel back, and it makes sweet little cat sounds, escorting you through a trauma hallway, before it rolls off with its toy kittens. I did like that part, and that was the closest I ever got to remembering any of the experience from Inheritance the first time I purportedly played it. So props to the cat. It is the Layers of Fear goat. Look, all in all, I absolutely do not hate this game, and in fact, like this game enough that I wanted to give it a little bit extra attention to analyze it here. It works in a haunted house experience kind of way, and by revisiting things here, I was able to shake this vague feeling of mixed bag uncertainty where I wasn't remembering all of the parts that did work, while retaining the vibes of things that didn't. It was well worth my time to do all of this again. So check it out if you're still interested. I wonder if I can make a YouTube video from real human pieces.